Not because I was hiding the work, because I am a civil engineer who has been managing construction schedules for 27 years, and early starts are how you get concrete poured before the afternoon heat affects the cure. And because the Charlotte October morning was at the temperature where early work is simply good practice. But also, if I am being honest, because I had known since the Monday Karen destroyed the hedges that the wall was coming, and I had known since month 4 of the situation, 8 months before she arrived with a chainsaw, that when the wall came, it would be built correctly and completely and without announcement. Karen had destroyed the hedges at 8:14 on a Monday morning. I know the time because my front camera logged her arrival. She had come with a hired crew, 3 men in a white pickup with equipment in the bed, not her own equipment. Hired equipment, which meant this had been planned in advance, which meant it was not an impulsive act, but a decision she had made and organized and contracted for. The hedges were 11 years old. Carolina cherry laurel, a species I had specified professionally for this application because it produces a dense, evergreen screen that achieves functional privacy within 3 years and maximum density within 7. At 11 years, they were 16 feet tall and 4 feet wide at the base, and had been, for the 4 years since we moved into the house, the feature of our backyard that made the backyard private. Private from Karen's property, which occupied the lot directly behind ours, and from which, without the hedge, our backyard was completely visible. The crew had the hedges on the ground by noon. 4 hours, 11 years of growth, root balls exposed, stems cut, the debris chipped and loaded into the truck bed. By 1 in the afternoon, the only evidence that the hedges had existed was the line of disturbed soil and the root crowns at ground level, and the photographs my wife Cecilia had taken at 8:22 when she called me at my office to describe what was happening. I had been at a site meeting 40 minutes away. I had told Cecilia to document everything and to call Leonard, and I had finished the site meeting because finishing commitments is a professional obligation, and I had driven home and stood at the backyard fence and looked at what had been there that morning and was not there anymore. The hedges were on our property. I had the survey to prove it. I had commissioned it in month 3 of the Karen situation, 7 months before she destroyed them, because I had understood by month 3 what kind of situation this was and had wanted everything documented before it escalated. The survey showed the hedges were 14 inches inside our property line at the closest point. She had destroyed 14 inches inside my property line with a hired chainsaw crew. I stood at the back fence and looked at Karen's house, now fully visible across the open space where the hedges had been. Karen was on her back patio. She was looking at me. She had the expression of a person who has done a thing and is waiting to see what happens next. I said nothing. I went inside. Cecilia was at the kitchen table. She said, "The chainsaw crew had a receipt." I said, "I know." She said, "They showed it to me. Karen paid them this morning." I said, "Yes." She said, "She planned this." I said, "I know." She said, "What are we doing?" I said, "Building the wall." She said, "Today." I said, "The permit has been approved for 6 weeks. Marcus is available. I'll call him this afternoon." She looked at me. "You had the permit approved before she cut the hedges." I said, "I had the permit approved in month 9. I was waiting for the right moment." She said, "The right moment." I said, "The moment the documentation was complete enough that the wall's purpose was self-evident and unassailable." She looked at the backyard through the kitchen window, the open space where the hedge had been, Karen's house visible beyond it. She said, "I think the documentation is complete." I said, "Yes." I called Marcus at 2:15. Marcus Webb was my contractor for structural concrete work. He had built 2 retaining walls and a foundation extension for me in the preceding 4 years and understood how I worked and what I expected. He answered on the second ring. I told him the hedges were gone. He said, "When do you want to start?" I said, "Forms tomorrow morning, poor Thursday." He said, "I'll have the crew there at 5:30. I said, "Thank you." He said, "How tall?" I said, 10 feet. A pause. "That's above the HOA limit." I said, 8 feet is the HOA limit with board approval. I have board approval for 8 feet. He said, "You said 10. I said 8 feet of reinforced concrete wall, 2 feet of decorative steel trellis panel on top, total height 10 feet. The structural wall is 8 feet and approved. The trellis is an architectural feature above the wall, which is a separate category under the HOA's architectural standards." He was quiet for a moment. "You've thought about this?" I said, "Since month 4. He said, 5:30 tomorrow. The forms went in Tuesday morning. 8 feet of height, 12 inches of thickness, rebar at 12-inch centers vertical and 18-inch centers horizontal. The footing was 30 inches deep in compacted subgrade, significantly deeper than required, because I was not building a temporary structure. The mix I had specified was 5,000 psi, commercial specification, the same specification I used for commercial retaining walls in my engineering practice. Karen came to her back fence at 6:47 while the forms were being set. She looked at the crew, she looked at the forms, she looked at me. She said, "What is this?" I said, "Permitted construction on my property." She said, "You're building a wall." I said, "Yes." She said, "You can't build a wall without HOA approval." I said, "I have HOA approval. The permit was approved 6 weeks ago." She said, "I'm calling the board." I said, "The board has already approved it. You're welcome to call them." She went inside. The concrete was poured Thursday. Marcus's crew worked through the morning, filling the forms in sections, vibrating the concrete to eliminate voids, scraping and finishing the cap. By 2 in the afternoon, the pour was complete, and the forms were scheduled for stripping on Saturday. The trellis panels arrived Friday morning. Custom fabricated steel, powder-coated black, a geometric pattern that Cecilia had designed. She is an interior designer and understands visual composition in a way that I, a civil engineer, appreciate professionally but do not produce naturally. The panels would be anchored to the top of the wall with embedded anchors that had been cast into the pour specifically for this purpose. Marcus's crew installed the panels Saturday afternoon after the forms were stripped. The wall was complete by Saturday evening. I stood in my backyard and looked at it. 8 feet of reinforced concrete, clean formed on both sides, the cap level and precise. The trellis panels above it, geometric and clean, adding 2 feet of height in a material that admitted light and air but not views. The total height was 10 feet from grade level. The total length was the full property line from the east fence to the west fence, 47 linear feet. From our side, Cecilia had specified a climbing rose system along the wall, steel cables anchored to the concrete at 12-inch intervals, up which she was going to train climbing roses over the next 2 seasons. By summer, it would be a garden feature. By the following summer, it would be the dominant visual element of the backyard. From Karen's side, the wall was concrete. Cecilia came to stand beside me. She looked at the wall for a moment. She said, "It's exactly what you designed." I said, "Yes." She said, "She can see it from her bedroom window." I said, "She can see the concrete side." She said, "And we'll see the roses." I said, "In 2 seasons." She said, "Worth it." I said, "Yes." My name is Desmond Osei, 52 years old, 27 years as a licensed civil engineer, the last 13 running my own firm specializing in structural engineering for residential and commercial construction in the Carolinas. I design things that are built to last. I design them to specification. I document them completely. My wife Cecilia is a licensed interior designer. She has spent 20 years designing spaces, understanding proportion, material, light, and the relationship between what a space looks like and what it feels like to inhabit it. She had specified the climbing rose system the same week I designed the wall. We had bought our home in Ridgemont, crossing 3 years before the Monday Karen arrived with a chainsaw crew. A 4-bedroom craftsman on a corner lot in a 44-home HOA outside Charlotte, a neighborhood with the established quality of a place where people had invested seriously in their properties. The Carolina cherry laurel hedge had been the defining feature of our backyard. Planted by the previous owners, 11 years old when we arrived, providing the complete visual privacy between our yard and the adjacent property that had been, for Cecilia, the feature that made the backyard functional as a design space. Karen Whitmore Aldridge had moved into the property behind ours 22 months before the destruction. She was 55, former marketing director for a regional real estate company, and had arrived in Ridgemont Crossing with strong opinions about how the neighborhood should look and the organizational energy to pursue those opinions through every available channel. The hedge was her first and most persistent opinion. She believed it blocked her morning light. She believed it created a moisture environment along her fence line that damaged her pavers. She believed it deposited debris in her yard that required maintenance. She believed that an HOA community should not contain private landscaping of this scale on a shared property boundary. None of these beliefs constituted a legal claim on my property. But Karen was not a person who relied on legal claims when social and institutional pressure was available. The first approach had been at a block gathering in month 2 of her residence, when she had described the hedge to me as dramatic and asked whether we had considered reducing it. I had said we had not and did not intend to. The second approach had been a letter in month 4, organized, professional, citing what she described as community aesthetic standards and expressing the hope that we could reach a mutually agreeable modification. I had responded through Leonard, our attorney, with a letter noting that the hedge was on our property within every applicable standard and that we were not interested in modification. The third approach had been an HOA complaint in month 6. She had alleged the hedge constituted a nuisance under the HOA's community standards provisions. The board had reviewed the complaint, reviewed the CC and RS, confirmed the hedge was within every applicable standard, and dismissed the complaint. By month 8, I had started the documentation log. I am a civil engineer. When a situation is developing in a direction that will eventually require documentation, you start documenting before you need it rather than after. The log had 41 entries by the Monday she arrived with the chainsaw crew. I had also, in month 9, submitted the wall permit application to the HOA board and the city simultaneously. The board had approved it in month 10, 6 weeks before the destruction. The city permit had been issued the same week. I had been waiting with an approved permit for 6 weeks before she cut the hedges. I had known by month 4 that the hedges were eventually going to be destroyed, not because I had specific information about Karen's plans, because I understood what kind of situation this was and where that kind of situation tends to go when the person pursuing it has exhausted every formal channel and has not received the result they wanted. The wall was the prepared response. The permit was the evidence that the response had been planned before the provocation, which was legally significant in the way that prior planning before a provocation is always legally significant. It established that the wall was not reactive, not retaliatory, but a property improvement that had been in process before any triggering event. Karen had not known about the permit. She had not asked. She had assumed the hedges would remain and that their continued existence would eventually become untenable for us in some way she had not yet identified. She had solved the hedge problem herself with a chainsaw crew and triggered the wall permit she had not known existed. The criminal complaint was filed Monday afternoon, the same day as the destruction. Leonard had the complaint ready. I had asked him in month 11 to prepare it against the contingency of exactly this event. Criminal mischief, North Carolina General Statute 14160, for the willful destruction of property with a value above $1,000. The replacement value of 11-year-old Carolina cherry laurel hedge at professional landscape rates was $38,000. The criminal mischief charge was a Class H felony. The civil complaint was filed Tuesday, the same day the forms went in. $38,000 in property damage, remediation costs for the root system damage that made immediate replanting impractical, legal fees, and the specific damage category available in North Carolina for willful destruction of trees, which includes treble damages under certain conditions. Leonard filed both with the same precision I had come to expect from him in 9 months of working together on this matter. The HOA meeting was called by the board president, a retired bank examiner named Patricia Kimball, who had been running the Ridgemont Crossing board for 6 years with the organized thoroughness of someone who had spent a career examining institutions for compliance. She called it Wednesday after I provided her with the complete documentation. She had read all 41 entries. She called me before the meeting. She said, "You've been documenting this since month 8. I said, "The log formally. I have notes going back to month 2. She said, "The permit." I said, "Approved 6 weeks before the destruction." She said, "You were waiting." I said, "I was prepared." She said, "There's a difference." I said, "Yes." She said, "The wall is built." I said, "Completed Saturday." She said, "Karen is going to object at the meeting." I said, "The wall has board approval. The objection won't have a procedural basis." She said, "I know. I'm telling you she'll object anyway." I said, "I know." She said, "How is Cecilia?" I said, "She's ordered the roses." There was a pause. "Good," Patricia said. The HOA meeting was Thursday evening. 38 of 44 households attended. Patricia presented the documentation herself, the 41-entry log, the 4 dismissed HOA complaints, the complete destruction documentation, including Cecilia's photographs from 8/22 on the Monday, and the wall permit approval and its date. She showed the photographs on the community center screen, the hedge at full growth from a photograph Cecilia had taken in August, the stumps on Monday afternoon. The room absorbed this. Then she said, "The wall permit was approved 6 weeks before the destruction. I want the membership to understand that clearly. The property improvement that is now complete on the Osai property was in process before the destruction of their landscaping, not in response to it." Theodore Briggs, a 12-year resident who had watched several previous HOA disputes evolve, and who had the specific quality of someone who did not speak often, but was worth listening to when he did, said, "She destroyed their property, and the wall was already approved." Patricia said, "Correct." Theodore said nothing else. His expression said enough. Karen was present with her attorney, a Charlotte litigator named Philip Morton, who had the measured quality of someone who had reviewed the documentation and understood the position his client was in. He had advised her not to speak at this meeting. She had spoken at the previous HOA proceedings, always to diminishing effect as the documentation became more complete. She did not speak. Philip Morton made one procedural objection during the permit discussion. Patricia overruled it correctly. The board voted formal censure for the willful destruction of property 5-0, formal finding that the wall installation was a permitted property improvement that the board had approved and would not be asked to reconsider 5-0, referral of the complete documentation to law enforcement in support of the criminal complaint 5-0. Karen's single potential ally on the board, a man named Robert Chen, who had been sympathetic to her aesthetic arguments in previous proceedings, voted with the majority on all 3. He told me after the meeting that he had not known she was going to hire a crew. He had thought the dispute was proceeding through proper channels. I said, 41 entries of proper channels. He said, I know that now. In the parking lot, Philip Morton found me at my car. He said, the wall. I said, is built. He said, 8 feet of concrete with trellis above. I said, 8 feet of structural concrete, approved by the board and the city, 2 feet of decorative trellis, which is an architectural feature above the wall structure. He said, she's going to argue the trellis exceeds the approved height. I said, the trellis is an architectural feature not a fence or wall structure. The CC and RS govern fences and walls. The trellis is a separate category. He looked at me. I said, I have a structural engineer's opinion on the classification. I have the CC and R provision language and its definitions. And I have the city's permit, which covers the complete installation, including the trellis. He said, you've been planning this for a long time. I said, since month 4. He said, and the permit was approved before she cut the hedges. I said, 6 weeks before. He was quiet for a moment. The criminal charge, I said, is proceeding. He said, the civil claim. I said, Leonard will discuss terms. He said, is there a resolution? I said, the wall stays. The criminal and civil matters proceed. If your client wants to discuss terms on the civil damages, Leonard is available. He said, she's going to want the wall addressed as part of any resolution. I said, the wall is a permitted property improvement on my property. It is not a matter for negotiation as part of any civil settlement. It exists, and it will continue to exist. He looked at me for a long time. He said, you built it at 5:30 Tuesday morning. I said, forms, the pour was Thursday. He said, before the dust settled. I said, the permit was approved 6 weeks before the dust settled. He extended his hand. You are a very prepared man. I shook it. Civil engineer, I said. We design things before we build them. He left. Corinne's husband Douglas found me as I was unlocking my car. He had been at the meeting in the back row. He was a structural engineer for a utility company and had, during previous HOA proceedings, attended with the disengaged quality of a man who was present because his wife expected his presence. Tonight he had a different quality. He said, I saw her hire the crew. I said nothing. He said, Monday morning, before I left for work, she told me she was having the hedge situation handled. I didn't ask what that meant. He looked at the community center entrance. He said, I should have asked what that meant. I said, yes. He said, the wall. I said, is built. He said, I can see it from our bedroom window. I said, the concrete side faces your property. He said, she's looking at a concrete wall because she destroyed your hedges. I said, that's the sequence. He said, I'm sorry, what she did was wrong. The hedges were yours and she had no right to destroy them and I should have stopped her and I didn't. I said, I appreciate that. He said, is there anything that he stopped? I said, the wall stays. The legal matters are proceeding. Douglas, I've been documenting this situation for 11 months. The documentation is complete. What happens next goes through Leonard and Philip. He said, I know. He looked at his shoes. The roses. I said, Cecilia's roses. He said, she told me about them. Corinne said Cecilia told her at the hardware store. I said, Cecilia is planting climbing roses on our side of the wall. He said, and our side is concrete. I said, yes. He was quiet for a long time. He said, that's very precisely fair. I said, civil engineers like precision. He shook my hand and walked back to the meeting to find Corinne. I drove home. The backyard was dark, but the wall was visible in the motion sensor light that activated when I came through the gate, 8 feet of formed concrete, the trellis panels above it catching the light at their geometric angles, the steel cables for the roses installed and waiting. Cecilia came out when she heard the gate. She looked at the wall for a moment. She said, the roses arrived Tuesday. I said, climbing roses take 2 seasons to reach the trellis height. She said, I know, I designed it. I said, what variety did you order? She said, New Dawn for the east section, it'll reach the trellis in 18 months. Don Quixote for the center, which is slower, but the color is worth the wait. And a repeat blooming climbing Cecil Brunner for the west end, because I like it. I said, you've been planning the rose selection. She said, since month 4. I looked at her. She said, "You weren't the only one who saw where this was going." I said, "No, apparently not." We stood in the backyard for a while. The wall stood where the hedge had been. It was not the hedge. The hedge had been living and growing and would have continued to grow for decades. The wall was different. The wall was permanent in a different way than living things are permanent, fixed rather than dynamic, immovable rather than generative. But it was ours. It was on our property. It was built correctly and to specification, and it would be there for the life of the house and beyond. And in 2 seasons, on our side of it, there would be roses. The legal resolution came 4 months later. The criminal matter resolved through a plea agreement. Karen entered a guilty plea to misdemeanor criminal mischief, reduced from the felony charge, with a fine and restitution to us for the documented value of the destroyed landscaping at the replacement cost rate Leonard and the prosecutor had negotiated. The civil settlement was completed 2 weeks before the criminal resolution. It included the replacement cost of the hedges, the remediation costs, the legal fees, and an acknowledgement, signed, notarized, filed with the court, that Karen had willfully destroyed landscaping on our property without authorization, and that she had no legal right or authority to do so. She signed it. Douglas had told Philip that his client would sign it without further negotiation. Philip had told Leonard this on a Tuesday morning, and Leonard had called me, and I had said that was acceptable. The wall was not part of the settlement. The settlement contained language acknowledging that the wall was a permitted property improvement on our property and that Karen had no claim against it and no right to request its modification or removal. She signed that too. Patricia Kimball received a copy of the settlement for the HOA's permanent records. She called me when it arrived. She said, "It's signed." I said, "Yes." She said, "The wall acknowledgement." I said, "Is in there." She said, "She signed a document acknowledging the wall is yours and she has no claim against it." I said, "Yes." She was quiet for a moment. "The roses." I said, "New Dawn is showing good growth. The Don Quixote is slower, but it's established." She said, "How long to the trellis?" I said, "Cecilia says another season for the New Dawn, 2 for the Don Quixote." She said, "And the concrete side faces Karen's property." I said, 47 linear feet of it." She said, "Desmond, I've been board president for 6 years. I've seen a lot of things. I've never seen a situation where someone destroyed a neighbor's property and the neighbor had the replacement permit approved and ready before the destruction happened." I said, "The documentation showed where it was going." She said, "Yes, it did." She paused. "Enjoy the roses." I said, "Cecilia will." Karen's house went on the market 3 months after the settlement. Douglas had made the decision. He told Theodore Briggs over the fence one afternoon because he needed to be somewhere that felt like a fresh start. Theodore had relayed this to me at the neighborhood mailboxes. I did not feel satisfaction about this. I felt the specific neutral completion that comes when a situation has reached its documented end through the correct processes. Their house sold in 41 days. The buyers were a young family, 2 children, a dog, parents in their mid-30s who had the uncomplicated energy of people who had found what they were looking for and were glad about it. They came to introduce themselves on a Sunday afternoon. They said they had heard the neighborhood was wonderful. I said we found it to be so. Their daughter, who was perhaps 8 years old, looked at the wall visible above the back fence line and said, "What's on the wall?" Cecilia said, "Roses." The girl said, "What color?" Cecilia said, "Pink, when they bloom." The girl said, "That's pretty." Cecilia said, "Thank you, we think so too." They left. We went back inside. I sat at my desk and opened the documentation log for the last time. 41 entries before the destruction, 2 entries from the destruction day itself, the 8/22 photograph documentation entry and the Leonard call entry, and then the entries from the subsequent 4 months as the legal matters resolved. I wrote the final entry. Resolution complete. Criminal plea entered. Civil settlement executed and filed. Wall acknowledgement signed. Landscaping replacement value recovered. Permit documentation permanent in city and HOA records. Roses established on east and center sections. West section planted. Documentation closed. I closed the notebook. The wall was in the backyard. The roses were on the cables. The trellis panels caught the afternoon light through their geometric cutouts and cast specific shadows on the concrete surface below. On our side, the roses. On Karen's side, on the new family's side now, who had nothing to do with any of it, the concrete. They would probably paint it. New families do things like that. It was their property now, and they could do what they wanted with it. But the wall itself, the 8 feet of 5,000 psi concrete on its 30-inch footing, engineered to the commercial structural specification I had designed in month 4 and built in month 22, that would be there long after everyone involved in this account had stopped thinking about it. That was what I had intended. A civil engineer designs for the life of the structure. The structure would outlast the dispute. That was always the point.